Talking about consciousness is always a bit of a delicate matter. Not even science knows what consciousness is. You know that the attempts to define it are still very far from reality. At the end of the 20th century, there was a scientist who said, well, in 20 years we'll know everything about consciousness. It's been 24 years since then, and we don't know a thing, just as little as we did back then. The attempts to define wherein the brain consciousness is located have, so far, yielded no satisfactory answers. In short, we're dealing with one of the greatest mysteries when it comes to human beings. What exactly is consciousness? So, our conversation today will be about the spheres of consciousness. What are the spheres of consciousness? Well, this talk is entirely based on a book by our international director, Professor Carlos Adelantado Puchal. This book is not in English yet. It's called The Spheres of Consciousness. I made a point of bringing some of its ideas. It's a very interesting book. Soon it will be translated into English and you'll be able to access it, okay? But I've already brought some ideas that I think are very important. The spheres of consciousness are what you might imagine as the rhythm with which consciousness awakens when you come into the world. The first thing we become aware of is ourselves. This is the first sphere of consciousness. You start to worry about this self, this little self. How does it survive? How does it feed itself? How does it satisfy hunger and thirst? How does it rest? How does it do all of this safely? How does it fulfill its desires? In other words, the first sphere of consciousness is focused on the self. The problems of the self. It will have to recognize itself and solve these problems. The second sphere of consciousness includes others, but those others who are really close, you know? Those who are directly connected to us. In other words, at first, our immediate physical family, those with very close blood ties, and then, over time, a few close friends. This second sphere of consciousness, believe it or not, is as far as most of humanity has gotten so far. In other words, a direct concern only for those who are around you. A third sphere of consciousness, which is a much larger sphere, is when we care about humanity. And not just humanity, but nature as a whole, with life itself, when we are committed on a macro level, that is, with the one, with everything that lives on the planet. We are committed to the very existence of the planet. This macro level of consciousness, you'll have to agree with me, is still quite rare in our times. So we are moving very slowly, very gradually, in homeopathic doses, from the second to the third sphere. We're going to talk a little about each one, and some tips he gives that are very interesting, including defining consciousness itself from a philosophical point of view. You might say, but you can't prove that. Of course, philosophy works with a hypothesis. You can choose to take it into consideration or not. Philosophy doesn't have dogmas, okay? It's a hypothesis that, throughout history, in both Eastern philosophy and ancient Western philosophy, has always been considered a very good one. But it's up to you to check if this makes sense to you, all right? So, according to philosophy, there actually is a definition for consciousness, which would be what? The first thing we can notice as a fundamental attribute of consciousness, which is almost a synonym for it, is perceptivity. In other words, consciousness is that which perceives. It perceives both outside and inside. Although, once again, at the stage we're at, we tend to perceive much more of the outside than the inside. Sometimes we don't even have any idea what we've been thinking about throughout the day. Do you remember if today you had any critical thoughts about someone? In that mess of thoughts you had all day long, can you remember that? Sometimes we don't even know what we've been thinking. In other words, at our level, consciousness is very little turned inward. It is more focused outward. But consciousness is simply this being that perceives. That still hasn't defined anything. That just says what it does, right? So let's go a bit further in explaining so we can get to this concept of consciousness. There's a doctrine in the East that they call the theory of impact, which is very clear and easy for us to understand. Consciousness is produced through contrast. Between two colors, you perceive both. If the entire universe were just one color, you wouldn't even notice that color. Between two musical notes, you perceive both. If there were only one musical note sounding all the time in the universe, you wouldn't notice it because there's no contrast. In fact, Pythagoras says that this note exists. He calls it the music of the spheres, which we don't perceive because it never stops, right? When you move from one city to another, sometimes it's only then that you realize the value of the city you left behind. You're able to evaluate it more objectively. Sometimes we only see the value of a person after we lose them. Isn't that right? And that's really unfortunate, but it happens a lot. So, awareness comes from contrast. And from the perspective of ancient, classical philosophy, both Western and Eastern, there is a great contrast in the universe. The greatest of all contrasts, which is the contrast between spirit and matter. Basically, the universe would have originated from a unity, and this unity, at a certain point, generated the primordial duality, which is spirit and matter, in other words, the physical and the metaphysical. And in the contrast between these two, the beginning of consciousness is produced. In fact, they say, even if you look at the Buddhist traditions in the East, they say the universe was born for this purpose, so that this unity could become aware of itself. Because when you only have one, you have no awareness of anything, there is no contrast. In other words, it would have been created to see itself in the mirror of dualities, in the mirror of manifestation, and from there we have some theories about this. I'll explain it very briefly. But anyway, what is consciousness? Consciousness would be an attribute of the spirit, what we call the eye of the being. What does that mean? Let's imagine, regardless of what you believe, let's just imagine as a theory that we have a subtle part and a concrete part, metaphysical and physical, spiritual and material, and that we came into the world to be able to know the world, to gain experiences in it. How does the spiritual have experiences in the material? According to what is said, a cell of the spiritual part descends into matter and gets to know each level of matter, one by one. This cell of the spiritual that descends and enters matter would be consciousness. It's as if consciousness were the eye of the being. So I brought a really silly example for you, but that's because the silliest examples are the ones we remember the most. This has already been proven. So, here it is. Jacques Cousteau and his boat. Back in my day, I used to watch Jacques Cousteau a lot. Today, I think most people don't even remember he existed. Jacques Cousteau was a man who had a boat and traveled the world making discoveries. Let's imagine that Jacques Cousteau is out there exploring once again, even though he passed away a long time ago. May God rest his soul. Right? Let's imagine he's doing some underwater exploration. He wants to find out what's in the ocean at a depth of 8,000 meters. Now, he knows that at 8,000 meters, no human can withstand that pressure, so he can't send a person down there. He sends a camera instead. So, a cable is used to lower the camera down to that depth. And it stays there for a while, capturing all the images from that area and sending them up to Jacques Cousteau's computer on the surface. And it sees everything it can see there, experiences everything it can experience there, and sends all that information to Jacques Cousteau's onboard computer, which is up above, hasn't gone into the water, just hovering up there. And that's how he does it. Soon, he wants to explore 7,000 meters deep. The camera comes up and moves to another level. Same thing. Then 6,000, 5,000. In other words, this camera goes through each level of the ocean, gathering all the experiences there and sending them to that control cabin up above. This is a simple example, but it helps you get a general idea of what the concept of consciousness is about. Consciousness is an attribute of being. The material world has its own attributes. In the material world, we have a mind, we have emotions, we have a physical body, we have energies. All of this is an attribute of the material world. The being, the spiritual self, would also have attributes, and one of them is consciousness. And consciousness would be exactly like this atom, this eye of his, that goes down into matter and picks up experiences, bringing them back up, accumulating experiences in this material world. This is basically a definition of consciousness. In other words, it accumulates information in those higher planes, going through increasingly elevated experiences, more and more elevated, because evolution is something that is expected, right? So the experiences keep getting more elevated, and it keeps accumulating them up there. And this would be consciousness from the perspective of ancient philosophy, especially in the East. That would be one definition. And then we could go back and talk a little more about consciousness. The greatest experience of consciousness would be the perception of unity. Remember what I told you, that in the beginning everything came from unity? And one day everything will return there as well. The Pythagorean decade talked about this. Everything comes from 1, and at the end, at 10, 1 plus 0 is 1 again. In other words, everything comes from unity, everything returns to unity. But as it is said, in essence, we are all one, we never stopped being one. We are part of the one. And it is said that the highest point our consciousness can reach is to realize that we are one. To realize that we are united, that the entire universe is a single being, that when I harm you, I automatically harm myself as well. That when I benefit you, I am automatically benefiting myself as well. It is said that this is not just conceptual or intellectual, but when you actually come to realize this, you reach a very high level of consciousness. When you see this as a fact. There is an exercise that we did recently in my philosophy classes, since I am still a student too, where the teacher, who has been my mentor since I joined New Acropolis, Professor Luis Carlos, led us through an exercise and asked us to use our imagination. A small imagination exercise. He asked us to imagine our consciousness entering a stone and to imagine the perceptions of a stone. Of course, a stone doesn't have vision or hearing. What does it perceive? She notices the heat on top of her, right? It contracts or expands depending on the temperature. It perceives the impacts it receives. It has resistance so that these impacts don't break it or crumble it. So it has this kind of perception. So for a moment, imagine your consciousness inside that stone. And then, after a while, you place your consciousness inside a plant and imagine the plant's perceptions. Try to feel them as vividly as possible. Feel the wind shaking you. Feel your roots drawing nutrients from the soil. Feel the sap flowing inside you. Feel when someone touches you or hurts you. Feel all the sensations a plant can have. Pay close attention to this. Do this exercise with a lot of care and patience. Then imagine any little animal, I don't know, a rabbit. Step inside that rabbit. Imagine what life is like in the forest, the fear of predators, the burrow it found, what it's looking for, how it searches for food. Imagine yourself completely immersed in that experience. Then, try to imagine that you are a human being, not yourself, but some other person. Anyway, when you do this exercise really well, and it only takes a few minutes, it can create a very curious effect in you, guys, which is that for a few seconds, your consciousness becomes dissociated from your form. You forget who you are, and you realize that consciousness exists independently of form. And for a few seconds, you feel that consciousness isn't just yours, it's a consciousness of the entire universe. And when you detach it from form, when you separate it from form, it becomes a universal consciousness. It's not just yours. This experience is interesting because if you really make an effort to feel each of these steps, for a few seconds, you forget who you are. And you start to realize that consciousness travels through all things, and it is one and the same. The consciousness that is in you, that is in the rabbit, that is everywhere, is one and the same. It's like that example I often mention about the Sutratma thread, a string of pearls, where the same thread runs through all of them, a silver thread. In other words, the essence of all of them is the same for the entire necklace. It seems that our consciousness is a spiritual attribute, and if we could distance it from matter, we would realize that our consciousness is universal. In other words, we would be close to unity. In other words, these are very simple experiences, but they already give us a sense of this, so we can realize that unity is not a fantasy. It's not just a theory made up by people who want to practice fraternity or charity, or whatever else. Unity is a fact. Your consciousness, when freed from form, identifies with everything. It is everything, all at once. So, let's continue with our Jacques Cousteau boat. We've already gone through that, right? So let's talk about the first sphere of consciousness. Consciousness, of course, as it begins its journey, the first thing it becomes aware of is itself, its physical body, the energies that flow through this physical body. Soon after, it becomes a bit more subtle, starts to notice emotions, and as it becomes even subtler, it perceives feelings. After a while, it starts to notice the mind, working with the mind in a very basic way. Soon it expands and starts to, yes, notice a whole range of other things. It keeps refining its use of the mind more and more. And this is the first identification. At first, it's very connected to the survival instinct. Okay, the survival instinct. In other words, I see myself, I protect myself, and I do what I need to do so that my life continues. At first, it's more basic. It's actually pretty selfish in the beginning, but it's the only identity that consciousness has at that initial moment of itself and of how to get out of any danger and how to survive. And this consciousness keeps expanding and starts to notice more subtle things in human beings, you know? So, over time, we evolve to notice and develop more of ourselves, our bodies, and their needs. We start to notice needs not just for food, not just for energy or rest, but also for good feelings, for emotional bonds, right? We start to feel the need for emotional bonds. We start to feel curious to learn about things, in other words, to use our minds. We begin to take ownership of other things. And then there are people who say that, besides these four elements we've talked about, which consciousness takes possession of and which make up what we call our personality, our small self, what are they? Physical body, energetic body, which is the energy that vitalizes this system. Emotional or astral body, and the mental body, the practical mind. This mind is what makes decisions about things in life. Besides these four elements that make up this denser part that we know, as we mentioned at the beginning, there are people who believe that there is something more, a subtler plane, a subtle plane, which some say has certain characteristics, but I won't go into that detail, that this subtle plane is generally called the soul. You've probably heard this word 1,000 times. But how do I know what the soul is? Everyone talks about the soul. How do I know what the soul is? Think about it. When these four elements, the quaternary, are focused only on survival, why on earth would it care about fraternity? Does fraternity serve any purpose for survival? Mine, no. I have to think about myself or those who are closest to me. I don't have to worry about being fraternal with everyone in the world. That's not natural for a mindset that's only focused on survival. Thinking about love, thinking about justice. You realize these are very subtle things, perceiving beauty, being moved by beauty. For someone who's only thinking about survival, that's useless. That's a waste of time. If you look at the most refined animals, those with intelligence similar to humans, even they don't perceive beauty. My cat notices it quite a bit because when I put a rose on the table, he goes over and eats the rose. He's very attentive. The rose, for him, that's what matters. In other words, he doesn't perceive beauty. He doesn't have that sensitivity for subtle things. So, if the four bodies that make up this self, this little self of ours, don't perceive these things, and yet we do, it means there's something more inside us. Where do these impulses come from? Just think about it. When you feel a deep emotion in the face of an act of justice, or when you witness a scene of profound beauty, when you're moved by an act of love, where is that coming from? Where are these perceptions coming from? Where is my consciousness at that moment? Your consciousness, at that moment, is in the soul. And what's interesting is that the more you can place your consciousness at that point, the more often you do it, the longer it stays there, the more human you become. Do you understand that? The more time my consciousness is placed at this point I mentioned here, when we perceive beauty and the sublime, justice and kindness, truth, when we are moved by all these things, that place where our consciousness is your soul. And that place is amazing, because it shapes you, it gives you a much higher perspective on the world. It lets you see from above, it gives you a much deeper understanding of what life is and what it's for. So, our big challenge would be to try to keep our consciousness, as much as possible, at that point, in that place, which is what we generally call the soul. All the subtle vehicles up there, we're generally calling the soul, right? So, the perception of the soul, I used this Christian phrase, by your works I will know you. I look at something and think, how can this benefit me? Is that the soul talking? Not at all. That's personal interest. That's personality. How can I take advantage of this? Is that the soul? It's not. It's not. How can I do something so that my life, in some way, brings some good, some benefit to others, to the world? That kind of observation? That comes from the soul, doesn't it? How can I do something so there's a little more justice in the world, so people suffer less? That kind of observation, you can be sure, comes from the soul. And since we have them, they definitely come from the soul, because they're not useful for survival. For mere survival, they actually just make things more complicated, because they increase our level of needs. They're not useful for survival, not for the body, anyway. They're useful for survival on more subtle planes. So we feel, we sense our soul. Now the question is how to keep our awareness there for as long as possible, right? Continuing on, I made this comparison here. The more our awareness stays there, the more we change our world. Our personal world, we start to feel things in a much deeper way. We begin to feel compassion for people, not just for physical misery, but for moral misery, psychological misery, spiritual misery. We sense people on a more subtle level. Sometimes that person everyone envies in society, look how much money they have, how much power, how much fame. You look at them, listen to them talk for 5 minutes, and you think, poor thing. Where's this poor person's awareness? Because you're perceiving much deeper things, and your compassion is happening on much deeper levels. You're no longer just on the surface, you're not just skin deep anymore. When you start to perceive things this way, you go much deeper within yourself, much deeper into the things around you, and you have a much greater ability to benefit the world, because you see what the real needs are in the world and in yourself, right? That's when I compared it to Grandma's house. The soul is the place where we nurture our identity. And all of us who know what it's like to have a grandma, right, who have that family memory, remember that place where, when we went there, we were spoiled, right? They gave us everything we wanted, right? Imagine that you had a wise grandmother who, besides giving you those delicious cakes, also gave you examples of her life, everything she learned, taught you those profound teachings that she accumulated throughout her life, in such a way that when you left there, you left nourished in body and soul. So, she nourished both the body and the soul. You just wanted to live at your grandma's house, never wanting to leave. Every time you had to go, there were tears, because you wanted to stay in that world where she taught you such beautiful, wonderful things, where you loved to learn, where you had the best and were nourished by the very best. Our soul is kind of like that. It's a place where, when we're there, we feel protected, because there you are nourished by the noblest things you have inside you, and you just don't want to ever leave. The longer you stay there, the more your life changes. Your whole life starts to adjust to a different set of values. Your path, your decisions, they all start to align with different values, and your life changes completely. Right? Sometimes a single decision we make from the soul can turn our whole life upside down, let alone spending a good amount of time there. Just imagine the consequences it brings. Continuing on. We need to grow within this small self, which is the personality down here, that only deals with survival, the perpetuation of the species. We need to grow within it so we can move beyond the small self and reach the greater self, up there, okay, the human soul, right? Our consciousness needs to rise higher and higher, to this plane. In other words, we already know where we need to go. We already know our destination, what our reference point is. We have to move from the small self to the greater self, to our true identity. That is our mission, individually speaking, okay? To refine the self, to trust in the laws of life and align yourself with them. Then he goes on to give a series of tips about how a person should communicate with themselves, how they should improve this relationship with themselves. One of the most fundamental things is to trust in life, folks. Life goes through cycles. That drives us crazy. We don't understand what that is. Why does it happen the way it happens? Why do such surprising things catch us off guard all of a sudden and turn our lives upside down? Why do we go through such tough cycles? When we accept that life is cosmos and not chaos, we accept that there is always a logic to what happens. And life always wants to teach us something. That will help us grow, even if at that moment we don't understand. But there is always, behind anything that content, a greater purpose. She always wants to make everyone involved their belief. Grow from that experience. Life isn't random. Life isn't chaos. Life has meaning. If you believe that, it's much easier to go through life's experiences. When we don't trust life, we feel wronged, unlucky, like people who have been marked to suffer, whatever it may be. We end up stuck forever with that victim mentality and ever attracting the worst to ourselves. Because if I suffered the worst once, I'll keep forever expecting it. We have to believe that life is a teacher and that it has some meaning in the things it does with us. In one of the talks I gave here at ASESU some time ago, I mentioned that during the pandemic, the number of people who asked me the following question: why did God allow the pandemic? And I thought, my God, I'll talk to him and I'll ask, what am I supposed to do? But it wasn't him who gave me that answer. It was my little dog out in the backyard at home. I shared that my dog was playing with the broomstick that was lying on the ground. I scolded her, put the broomstick back where it belonged, standing upright in the corner, nice and quiet. When I turned around, she was, ears perked up and her head tilted, like this. Her face was full of questions. It was as if she wanted to say to me, humans are crazy. What's the difference if this thing is here on the FL? There are for me to play or over there by that wall? That was the look on her face. It wasn't. There was no sense in what I had done. Then I thought, man, even if I spoke her language, I still wouldn't be able to explain it, because I'd need concepts like aesthetics, could justice, which she doesn't have. So she would, even if I spoke her language. The only chance she has is to love me, to realize that I love her, and to trust me and walk with me, because at some point she'll understand. Then I stopped and thought, wow, if there's a God up there, he must be thinking exactly the same thing about us. Even if I came down here to talk to you in Portuguese, in your own language, there are concepts you still don't know. To understand the meaning of the things that happen, you need to walk further. At this meant, just love me, realize that I love you, and keep moving forward. At some point you'll understand all these things. I found that so enters. You have this, a little symbolic experience, right? That showed me once again that life really does have meaning. And if we start from that point, it's much easier to go through life's experiences, right? Right? Another thing he recommends is to be a lifelong learner, wanting to grow, not thinking you already know everything, not feeling like you own the truth, always wanting to raise your consciousness to a higher level, considering that every human being you meet is a mystery, that they have something to teach you. Every human relationship is an exchange, where you can offer something and receive something in return. Every human being holds a mystery, a bridge, and always be seeking to expand your consciousness, searching for the unknown, seeking to understand the greater meaning of life, striving to go beyond. Never think you own the truth, because the moment you believe you do, you stop learning and growth is no longer possible. Another thing, chooses your purpose something greater than just merely surviving. This is fundamental in the realm of the self, right? For it to leap to the grandmother's house, for it to leap to the soul's perspective, it needs to choose as its purpose something greater than just surviving. Surviving with comfort, with pleasure, and that's it. Well, we have too much potential to dedicate ourselves to something so small. Nature is probably waiting for us to do something for others, for the world, for ourselves, to make us more human. Nature probably wants us to do something within our potential for love, for brotherhood, for justice, for kindness. It wants us to change the world using these tools that it gave us. for us to have a bigger purpose. As I always, and I say that we do not accept leaving here, same size as when we arrived. We should want to expand, to want to go further. In other words, a purpose greater than just surviving. That's another thing. That is established in this relationship with our own self, right? Knowing how to make choice has. Our life, in the end, is a result of our choices. What do I take into account when I make choices? Do I only consider what could benefit me personally? What do I get when I only think about myself? A life focused only on personal interests. But if I start to consider how I can benefit someone else with this decision, how I can benefit more people with this deck, I start to have a bigger focus, a more altruistic one that includes other people, and my life starts to change. In the end, our life is the result of our decisions. Be careful that the motivation behind all your decisions isn't just personal interest, because that will make you very small, much smaller than you in to be, right? That's one of the observations he brings up. St. George and the dragon. What does St. George and the dragon have to do with all of this at this point, right? Philosophically, when we talk about the physical body, the energetic body, the emotional and mental body, we associate in. Not us. It's always been like this. It was associated with the four elements of alchemy, right? In other words, the physical body would be earth, the energetic body, the etheric body, the energy that flows, the life energy that runs through our body would be water. In fact, when you notice water flowing, it gives you an impression of energy, right? Our emotional body would be air. It can be a gentle breeze when it's a positive feeling, or it can be a real hurricane when it starts spinning around a negative feeling, right? And the mental body is associated with fire. But our soul is above these four elements and has some ability to master them. That's where a myth like St. George comes in. Take a look at the little creature. It's an amphibian. It has a whole fish tail, like something that lived in the water. It actually moves in the water, but comes onto land. In other words, it has water and has land, but it doesn't stop there. It has wings, the animal, tour. In other words, it has air too, and it doesn't stop there because it breathes fire through its nostrils. So, it has all four elements. This creature, it embodies the four elements. And then there's St. George, the soul, who comes and subdues it. In other words, there's something heroic about subduing our four other domains, our four bodies, the domain of the soul, the values of the soul, the virtues of the soul. We become St. George. We relive this drama. We gain something heroic when we are able to master these four worlds, making them obedient to the principles of our human soul, which, as we've already mentioned, are values, virtues, and whatever degree of wisdom we have already attained, right? So it's a myth that's talking exactly about what we're discussing. NTE is talking about the domain of the four elements. Knowing the law of cycles, there's an S missing there, right? And not being surprised by them. I don't know if you've ever heard of that Chinese tale. Chinese that is long. I only know one P. I give it away because I don't have the patience to tell it all. He says that one day a young man won a horse. Then the neighbors went to talk to his father. How wonderful is that? How amazing. Why, our son won a horse, and then he said it could be good, it could be bad. Do you know this one? The next day, BAM, he falls off the horse and breaks his leg. Then here come the neighbors, WH. What a shame, how terrible, your son broke his leg. And what did the old man say? It could be good, it could be bad. The next they declared to all young people, were drafted, except for his son who, and it was C, broken leg. And that's how the story went. The story goes on and on. In other words, nature alternates in cycles. That's how it is. We see how it works. It's spring, summer, fall, winter. Some are harder to survive. Others are easier. Some are for planting, others for harvesting. It alternates within our day. Morning, afternoon, night, dawn. Morning again. Some cycles are more about retreating. Others are more about expansion. It reve. Z more pleasant, easier cycles, with more arid, more difficult cycles. In our own lives, we go through cycles. It seems like when, as we get older, we look like our children. Again, right? In other words, the cycle comes full circle. Anyway, be prepared for the cycles. What you have today, will you have it forever? Probably not. So, make sure to value it today. Expect that at some point, everything we possess, even this physical body here, will be taken from us because it's temporary. We're not in a world of permanent things. Here, everything passes. Be prepared so that they don't catch you by surprise. RD, so that you know how to react when a cycle comes that's harsher than the one before. Value what you have today. Deserve what you have today. Get ready because at some point you may experience more difficult cycles, as difficult. If you understand the law of cycles, they don't surprise you. And they don't catch you off guard, you're able to react better. You're prepared to respond better, which is one of the fundamental things, right? Giving the right answers suitable for life so that you are not dragged by panic, by by fear, which are all part of the lower levels, down in our animal consciousness, right? That lower nature that we're trying to master. Practicing right action. Have you ever heard of right action? It's one of the most talked about things in Eastern traditions. Right action, He middle path is simply a free and voluntary action you can't have been forced to do because otherwise it has no value at all. It's a free and voluntary action without attachment to the results, done for the joy of being part of it. This develops the heroic within us. If you stop to think about it, this act that we're doing right here, right now, of holding a conference to gather resources to meet the needs of people down in the South, does it bring any benefit to us? Any personal benefit for us? Unless you post it on your social media so everyone thinks you're a good person. But if you don't do that, it doesn't bring any personal benefit. But in any case, we have the satisfaction of having taken part in it. The satisfaction of having contributed our efforts to a cause that is valid, that is important. This is right action. It's detached from the results. It's free. No one forced you to do it. You wanted to do it and you feel fulfilled by participating, fulfilled by doing it. You don't want the results for yourself. It's an absolutely unselfish action. And that's a fundamental element. Because it leads the mind to move away from things that are merely selfish, merely personal. In other words, to practice right action more and more. I do my best and the results are not for me. I want nothing else but the honor of having taken part in something so important. Something so great. Once I played this little game with my youngest daughter. I used to love doing these philosophical experiments with her. One day I went up to her and said the following: once upon a time, there was a charming prince, and the king came to him and said, I went to him and said, hi, my daughter who was captured by an evil witch. Then the prince put his hand on his hip and said, how much will you pay me for that? If the pay is good, who knows? Right away, she said, no, Mum, stop with this story. This prince is an ID. Mouth, it's no use. I don't want to hear that story. That prince is good for nothing. Imagine how much you pay for that. Is that something you should say? Because even she, as a child, must have been about 5 or 6 years old, Pimentina, she already knew that if it's for personal gain, then he's not a prince. The PRI. Sipe is great. He is good exactly because he is fair. If you go, you play personal interest, you take away his hero, his ism, and then the story is no longer worth it. No more interest. I don't want to hear about this Rinse. He's an idiot. Don't tell me the story anymore. That's just how it is. In other words, that intuition from childhood, that reaction. And that's what makes the little story interesting. And that's what makes our own story staying too. To develop realizations and not just beliefs. Be careful, Vika. You sometimes were full of beliefs that you never actually went to check if they were true. You just settle for it because everyone believes. Then it must be true. Or the people around you, more close, believe. So it must be true. Each time, more replaces beliefs with notes, observations. Beliefs are very superficial. They don't give us much security. Sometimes people ask me, do you believe in God? I say, no, not believe. I know. To believe is something very distant. I know, and I feel it. Sometimes I doubt myself, but God, never, because I feel this clearly. So, in other words, more and more we should replace beliefs with observations. There is a window behind the curtain. Then you have two things you can do about this fact. Either you accept, yeah, I believe you, you're saying it, I believe you, or you say, no, I don't believe it, I'm a skeptic, I don't believe it, ICO, I don't believe it. Both cases, you have being guided by beliefs. In both cases, you're being guided by beliefs. What you should do is come here, pull back the curtain, and see what's behind it. In other words, replace beliefs with observations. Go out into life and make observations. Don't spend your whole life relying on beliefs, which are superficial. They're more of a judgment based on whims than on evidence. Make your concepts more concrete each time. Always strive to understand life as it really is, right? Convert problem into tests. That's one of the most interesting things there is, and it has to do with what we've already talked about, knowing how to face difficulties, trusting in life, turning problems into tests. Imagine if I came to you and said the following: she hasn't arrived yet. She's waiting outside, about to come in. Then I tell you, look, when she gets here, we're going to say that we made an agreement here, that we would draw a person to summarize everything that was said in the lecture up to now, and that the person chosen was her. So that means she has to come up here and say everything that was discussed. Guys, she would feel wronged. She would be upset. This is absurd. They're trying to humiliate me in this lecture. How could they do this to me? But if she had heard outside that this was just a test to see if she had psychological balance, it was just a go, no, so much easier. She would show up here with the most shameless face in the world and say, look, I only have one thing to say. And I repeat the words of Socrates, all I know is that I know nothing. I know. Bye. Sit down. That's it. It's over. I know it's a test. If I know it's a test, the things in life become so much easier. Tests are made to help us grow. This is a very important threshold of consciousness. When we start to see life's difficulties as tests that aren't meant to bring us down, but to give us an opportunity for growth, and then you start facing these tests with feeling every time you overcome these tests, you feel a sense of glory, of having been victorious, of having fought the good fight. The eternal struggle of our higher self against our lower self, of our human soul against our animal soul. We have fought the good fight, and today I was victorious. In other words, that's the feeling of glory. I managed to push my trenches of consciousness a little further ahead. That gives us a very different perspective on life. There are no more problems. There are only tests that life, when it tests someone, it's because it wants to move them to another level. Just like in our school grades, if you go through tests, it's to approve you for another level of consciousness, right? To have dignity. The B. Book spends a good deal of time talking about and this feeling of dignity as important it is, that it's about self-respect. There's no one else watching. I'm the one watching. My conscience is tenderly looking at me. She has seen me, and I deserve respect. I won't subject myself to indignities. It's not because so-and-so, this person, or that person will think something, but because I would lose respect for myself. That's something that's hard to get back. It's no joke. From that point on, when you try to make plans to have a serious talk with yourself, a little voice inside you will say, here you go again. Just stalling. When it's time to actually do things, you just do them any old way. So what's the point of all this planning? Whole thing? That is key. Losing confidence in yourself is something very serious. It diminishes our awareness, humiliates us, makes us feel very small. So it is to dig. Nighty is an element, fundamental element in this relationship with ourselves. Respect by itself. Why do I do it? Because I don't deserve this. Sometimes the person in front of you might deserve to hear something, but I don't deserve to say it. You know? I don't deserve to say it. I'm not going to F I won't reach that level, right? I respect myself. Be aware of struggle between the higher self and the lower self, which happens every day in every decision you make. The decision I made today, what was it for? Who won? Because that will tell you which direction you're heading in. This struggle is present in even our smallest decisions. Right now, in the decision about what you're going to think about, there's a struggle between the higher self and the lower self, between the soul and the body, between the human soul and the animal soul. And this struggle exists at every moment. You have to stop at night and take a look. What were my victories throughout the day? Who won today? Because that is what will prevail in my tomorrow. Then I will need to change my strategy. I have to create one as if I were a military strategist, really. Change my war strategy so that tomorrow my higher self, my soul, can have more victories, right? Fight every single day. Oh, but there's no break. It's like saying you're going to take a break from breathing, from your heartbeat. If you take a break, if you pause your breathing or your heartbeat, you die, my friend. Physically, you're dead. If you take a break from the functioning, Ona, your soul, you are spiritually dead. You're just surviving. There's a line from that movie Braveheart, I don't know if you remember, where he says, all men die, but not all men truly live. Some just survive. Be. Right? So, when I start to take breaks in the functioning of my soul very often, I end up reducing myself to just a being that survives. There's no more life. There's no longer that higher awareness where I find my true identity, right? I brought here for you another myth that reflects this very well. Does anyone know the Bhagavad Gita? Bhagavad Gita. Is an Indian book that, in short, talks about the battle between these two armies, the Pandavas and the Kauravas. The battle between these two armies is the battle between the human self and the animal self within us. Animal within us. That is, it's an epic that talks about this fundamental question of life. It's very beautiful that the book says even the stars move more slowly to see what happens on this battlefield, because it's the fate of every man that is being decided there. Who will win today? Who will win right now? Don't think you need to take a break from this fight. This is life. This is what it's about. If you stop fighting, you're dead.